And we are moving to Sylvia Obregon Quiroz. I hope I said it right. European Coalition for Corporate Justice, talking a little bit what's going on when we want, what is happening now in Europe, what are we doing in order to make these conditions better, to improve the conditions, the relations and the causalities between our consumption in Europe and the situation not only in Brazil, but also other countries.
Thank you very much, Shiva, and focusing on the organizers of this event. It's highly relevant now at the moment when the Slovenian government is in the presidency of the council, and when the discussions of human rights due diligence are taking more and more relevance, not only at European, but international level, and also at the member state level. And that's a little bit of what we're going to see on the state of play. Maybe just briefly to introduce ECCJ is a coalition of more than 450 organizations from 17 countries, combining together, bringing together national platforms, trade unions, consumer organizations, and academics working on corporate accountability. So it's a very large network of European organizations and trade unions. We have been working for human rights due diligence since many years ago, calling the EU and different member states to bring forth law or legislation that addresses and makes compulsory, mandatory, what already existed in international frameworks that, for instance, the UN Guiding Principles on Human Rights or the Tripartite Declaration of the ILO on principles concerning multinational enterprises, as well as the OECD guidance for responsible business conducts, which are in general the main systems of principles that exist to prescribe what is this management process that is supposed to accompany the companies to efficiently identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for the negative human rights and environmental impacts in their activities. We have seen that these were very important first steps since 10 years ago, more or less, that it started to be agreed at international level. But in the time that has passed, we have identified a civil society and with the institutions behind these principles and at government level that there have been failures in the implementation of these principles because they have been largely voluntary. So at this point, we are facing a stage when the evolution of these principles, it's inviting states to take mandatory legislation as the next step forward. So we have seen that already at European level, for instance, there have been like 3 stages of regulatory levels. And we saw the first reporting obligations appearing in the British Modern Slavery Act, as well as the European Non-Financial Reporting Directive. Now it's called the CSRD, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, that it's under revision this year and passing again the whole process of the legislative proposal, precisely because some of the enforcement aspects of the regulation were not strong enough to yield the results that were expected with this reporting directive. Then we have seen a second level of regulatory wave, including the Dutch child labor due diligence and the European timber regulation and the conflict minerals regulation. All of these have included specific due diligence obligations, but mainly or largely enforced in administrative ways. So now we are moving, and France was the first country that did this, moving towards broad due diligence that also include legal liability attached to the due diligence obligation. So in this one is not only one sector like timber or conflict minerals, or one type of adverse risk such as child labor, but a general blanket obligation to respect all human rights and environmental standards in all sectors. And this is what France brought forward in their legislation. And additional to that, one very important move forward was that it attached legal liability to it. So when there is a failure or harm, a failure to comply with the legislation or harm can be proven, the company will be legally liable for it. My apologies, I forgot to update this part. There is also a legislation now in Germany that passed recently, now during the summer. And it's also a broad due diligence. Well, back to the regulatory levels, now we have the German law that also is a broad legislation. And it also includes the possibility for German civil society organizations or trade unions to bring forward claims on civil liability grounds whenever there is sufficient of substantive knowledge and proof that there have been a breach of the legislation by a German company. However, it does not provide new civil liability avenues. And this is something that we want to see the EU taking more into a higher level in their proposal. One of the questions that the colleagues from Focus posed when inviting us to this event. So what are the main claims or calls that civil society has for the European Union now in its process of bringing forward European legislative proposal? Well, first, that business must respect all human rights and environmental standards in their operations and along their global supply chains within their business relationships. This means covering the full extent of the supply chain. We have seen from Mauricio's presentation, for instance, that some of the most severe human rights abuses are happening at the lowest tiers, at the very beginning of the value chains, and not applying this obligation all across the value chain would leave unprotected the people and the environment in foreign countries where the value chains begin for these European companies. We also demand as European civil society, and there is a large coalition of organizations behind this, an obligation to identify, assess, seize, prevent, mitigate, monitor, and account for potential and actual human rights and environmental adverse impacts in accordance to existing international due diligence standards. So taking already the basis of what exists with the United Nations Guiding Principles and the OECD guidelines as a deporting point of what are the specific steps of this due diligence process. The third would be that the third and fourth that related to what we call access to justice and remedy, and is that companies should be obliged to provide and cooperate in remediation of these impacts, and that they should be held liable for the human rights and environmental impacts in their global supply chains. We also ask for member states to ensure robust enforcement of all the above obligations, both in civil and administrative ways, and for the legislation to be cross-sectoral, covering all business enterprises and including financial institutions, and that this legislation should apply as overriding over existing or pre-existing legislative bodies. So what has happened in the EU during this last year? In 2020, in April, we had this very important first step of the Commission announcing the Corporate Due Diligence Initiative. Then in July of 2020, the Commission published the impact assessment, inception impact assessment of the initiative, that then in October opened up the space for a public consultation on due diligence. This consultation went until February, but in December, we had already the council conclusions during the German presidency, in which they called the Commission to table ambitious legislation. And they referred to several instruments that, for instance, the Fundamental Rights Agency had already put forward, or reports that the European Parliament have put forward with regards to access to justice and the need to regulate global supply chains. In January, the Jury Committee adopted a due diligence report. The Jury Committee is the Legal Affairs Committee at the European Parliament that then was voted in March. And by February, we had the results and the closure of the public consultation of the due diligence, and that had a massive response. I will show you a little bit of what was the citizens and civil society response on it. And that was then backed by a positive adoption of the report of the Legal Affairs Committee in the plenary in the Parliament, sending a very strong and clear signal to the Commission about the level of ambition that the Parliament is expecting from them. Now, the process is a little bit in a slow pace, as there have been delays in what was expected would be the date of release. We had expected at the beginning of the year that this would be in June. However, during summer, there were some delays, and now we're expecting that the proposal would come in October of 2021, otherwise until the end of the year, as the President von der Leyen has mentioned in one of her latest letters in response to a parliamentary request asking about the speed of the process, and she confirmed that it's still within the Commission's plan for 2021. So we expect the proposal to come out in 2021 still. So we have the European Parliament report, the public consultation responses, and the Council as already three important developments coming from the European Union, giving us indication of how serious and important this process is for them. And it's also an issue of high relevance for citizens all around the world, and the European citizens who responded massively to the public consultation. It has been one of the largest responses that the Commission has ever received in a public consultation, with over 1 million responses of civil society organizations and citizens calling for the legislation to cover human rights, environmental and social impacts throughout the whole supply chain, to have TEED, as we call it in the campaign, which means including strong penalties for companies that break the rules, to make companies liable for their bad practices at home and abroad, to involve trade unions, and to consult with potentially affected communities when defining the due diligence process, as well as to make it easier for victims of corporate abuse, trade unions, and civil society to seek justice in EU courts. This is a very important point, because referring back to one of the questions that was made to Mauricio, it is important that there is strong legislation in the host countries of these corporations, but very often it is impossible for the host countries to make European companies pay when their assets are all in Europe. So even if there are strong legislations in the producing countries, if there are no rules in the home countries of these corporations that can really be enforced over where the siege is, there is very little access to justice that the victims will have. And that has been the case now. And we have seen that there is already empirical proof that that it has been a challenging process. And for instance, the Shell case that Siva mentioned at the very beginning is one of those in the Netherlands. It took more than 13 years for the courts to come to a ruling, and several of the victims of that case have passed away during that time. So with the current system that we have, it's a very, very lengthy process that does not yield to access to justice for victims. So we need to ensure that this legislation grants access to justice in EU courts without such massive delays. So what are the elements that we think are going to be in this legislation? We don't know yet, but we can have an indication of those based on the main elements coming from the proposal of the Parliament, from the report of the Parliament. And in terms of scope, we hope that this legislation will cover all large companies and SMEs in high-risk sectors. Actually, it's high-risk type of SMEs, and there will be a set of criteria that it will need to be established to define what are those high-risk SMEs. We hope that it includes all human rights and environmental standards, and also governance to account for corruption within the possible negative impacts, that it reaches the whole value chain, and that it has both types of enforcement, public and private, meaning that there will be an administrative authority at member state level, mandated or with powers to investigate and to sanction whenever there has been a failure in the process, but that there is also this civil liability part that gives victims access to courts for harm by the companies or by controlled entities. That's what the report of the parliament is saying. This is not happening in isolation, and I think I'm going to quickly conclude with this. We have not only the law in France, as I mentioned, we have also now a law in Germany. In Norway, there is also a new law on business transparency and human rights and decent working conditions. And there are 3 parliamentary proposals for national law in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Austria. Actually 4, there is one in Luxembourg that was recently launched as well. And there are campaigns from civil society in all over Europe. So this is a wave that has no stop. We see that there is a growing momentum for legislation, both at national and regional level, and even that there is a process at international level. In the UN, there is the binding treaty on business and human rights, trying to address also some of these gaps of governance on international law for the operations of transnational corporations. There in the slides that Ziva probably will share with you, you will see also a comparative table with more detail of what are the main aspects of the European Parliament's proposal compared to the existing 3 laws and the upcoming parliamentary requests in Austria, the Netherlands, and Belgium. And just to then finalize with this, we see that the Sustainable Corporate Governance Directive, which is the long name that the Commission has given to the due diligence law, it's one of many legislative processes that are aiming to bring fairness to the business and human rights sector. And it's a very complex web, but we have been trying to work with several of, learning from several of these processes, also to make the Sustainable Corporate Governance Directive as complete as possible.
I can actually read it so everybody can hear it. Do you know how the EU Commission is dealing with this amount on submissions? And do we know on who submitted the majority of the remaining 500,000 submissions?
Yes, so we have had requested the Commission to explain precisely this question, because they did a report, like a summary report of all the responses they received from the consultation. And they simply mentioned that they had received over 500,000 and they identical or similar responses calling for this and this and that, so that they have counted that within their study as a mass response. But we have requested them to be more detailed in how are they integrating the responses for the impact assessment. But so far we have not received the impact assessment. It has not been published, and we have not received any response with regards to more detailed explanation as to how these responses have been integrated. However, we do know that they noted that the number is massive, because it is, if not the most, one of the most, the biggest responses that they have ever received in the history of public consultations of the Commission. And the majority, well, we had 700 civil society organizations responding, but the vast majority were citizens, both from Europe and from around the world. We had a division, there were 2 campaigns, one that collected about 150,000 of responses within Europe, and 400,000, the majority of them were from global citizens.
Thank you, Sylvia. Any other questions? I don't see any. So thank you, Sylvia. There's another one, Francisca.
No, just well, a short one on this issue. No, because you mentioned that in total there were over 1 million submissions. So I was wondering from who the remaining 500,000 comes. Were these industry association, or is it? Or can I look it up on their website? Because that means that in total, I mean, not only civil society, but that industry is heavily engaging too. So this was but I can look it up if they're with the website. Or
No, let me just clarify. I said over 500,000, maybe.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
But yes, there were some responses from business associations and governments as well.
Okay, thank you.